Eugène Delacroix expressed passion through death and slaughter, yet he was actually a quiet person. Xu Wei called himself Man of Ivy, but he was as irritable as a tiger. Both Delacroix and Xu created a passionate era, and each was regarded as the forerunner of Romanticism in their own country. These are the most famous women in the Louvre Museum. They're closely associated with female characteristics, including love, elegance, purity, jealousy, youth, enjoyment, and maternity. She, however, is an exception. This half-naked female was a revolutionary. Of all the rioting people in the street, she is in the most conspicuous position. The painter was Eugène Delacroix, a French romantic artist. He once said that without great risks, there can be no beauty. In China, the painting of ink grapes, painted by Xu Wei of the Ming dynasty, is in the collection of the Palace Museum. These seemingly simple and free brushstrokes reflect Xu Wei's extremely cruel life. These freely painted grapes are totally different from the rebellious woman in the Louvre Museum. So why were they both mentioned in the historical retrospectives of the two museums? What's the connection between the two painters and their paintings? To understand French Romantic painting, we have to start with this portrait of a man in the Louvre Museum. This is a self-portrait of Eugène Delacroix, painted in 1829. Delacroix painted himself as he saw himself. It seems that the man in the painting looks romantic in a certain way. Xu Wei, on the other hand, seems a little anxious and haggard in this portrait painted by someone else. Delacroix is regarded as a representative of French Romantic painting, while Xu Wei symbolizes Chinese Romanticism in the 16th century. Without their artworks or spirits, the Louvre Museum and the Palace Museum would be as pale as nightfall. The China Academy of Art is located in Hangzhou, where Xu Wei once lived. Painter Xu Jiang has always wanted to trace the connections between Xu Wei and Delacroix.
那么中国的晚明的浪漫主义代表人物，那显然就是徐渭。法国的浪漫主义代表人物，如果我们要取一个的话，那肯定是德拉克罗瓦。把徐渭跟德拉克罗瓦比，他们也有截然不同的地方。 这个截然不同，恰好是我们两个民族他们的文化表达、他们的文化思考、他们的文化品味的一个深刻的不同。
In 1830, Delacroix portrayed a woman in the center of this painting. She is half naked, holding a gun with a bayonet, and behind her is a group of life-size figures, including street loafers, craftsmen and soldiers with guns and swords. On the ground are people's bodies, some still bleeding. Interestingly, Delacroix may have put himself in the painting too, as a university student who looks more like an adventurer. The painting is 2.6 meters high and 3.2 meters wide. It's based on the street battles during the French Revolution of 1830. Is it merely a depiction of the reality of that time? Where does its romance lie? The same question also applies to this picture in Beijing's Palace Museum. These are grapes, commonly seen in our daily lives. Chinese people are quite familiar with the painting tools, brushes, rice paper and ink. Yet, to the untrained eye, there's nothing special here. The painter Xu Wei wrote a poem in the upper left corner. He said he had suffered many frustrations. He had become old, yet no one wanted his paintings. His works were all left aside. In short, it was a real pity that no one had noticed his talent. Was this painting just a simple complaint? What kind of passion and romance can we find in this painting? A battle led by a woman and ordinary grapes. What do they have in common? As a follower of Delacroix and a researcher of Xu Wei, Xu Jiang devoted himself to looking for the real connections between Chinese and Western paintings.
所以我们借鉴了德拉克罗瓦的那种红棕色的调子，加强那种血流成河，令人血管喷张的那种感觉。所以我们在用笔上，我们更加奔放。 这个用色上，你看这里都是土红，土红里头呢有古绿色的点子，强化这种被血染过的这个土地。
In his serial paintings entitled Sunflower Garden, Xu Jiang imitates Delacroix's oil painting skills. His paintings also reflect his state of mind as a Chinese scholar. From his paintings, we can feel Chinese people's sadness, loneliness, and expectation towards nature and the unknown world. So, how does Xu understand romance?
所以浪漫它是指向一种激情，一种率性率真，一种突破常规，一种革命性的举动。
To Xu, romanticism in a painting has a lot to do with the painter's personality. It is not the affectionate and graceful romance we commonly understand. Such an interpretation of romance is the key to our understanding of Delacroix and Xu Wei. Located in central Paris, there's an ordinary building. It's Delacroix's former residence. Now it has become a small museum attached to the Louvre. Christophe, a researcher of the Louvre Museum, has been studying Delacroix for many years. He describes his impression of the Romanticists to us.
Peut-être que tous les artistes romantiques auraient été difficiles à vivre, si on doit vivre avec eux, parce qu'ils ne sont pas ponctuels, ils ne viennent pas à l'heure au rendez-vous. Mais on trouve que c'est plutôt sympathique, émouvant, même si c'est certainement assez compliqué de vivre de manière romantique, parce que ça peut être très triste, très intense, de partager le malheur du monde, etc.
Christophe's interesting description of the Romanticists brings us back to the Paris of Delacroix's time. The years around 1830 were full of passion. Having gone through revolutions, wars, and the decline of kingship, the French people turned their attention to the reform of literature and artistic innovation. Rousseau's Confessions advocated individual liberation. Female writer George Sand wrote in her works, "A more human and no less sacred link will replace marriage, assuring the existence of children who will be born of a man and a woman without forever shackling the freedom of one and the other." In France and even the whole of Europe, the thought of romanticism, of seeking freedom and liberation, gradually came into fashion. 180 years ago, a young man was running in the streets of Paris. The sight of a painting had made him extremely excited. 400 years ago in China, a middle-aged man was sticking a sharp weapon into his own head. There was blood all over his face. That young Westerner was Delacroix. Later on, he wrote in his diary, "I can see that my turbulent mind needs agitation, needs to free itself, to try 100 different things before reaching the goal whose tyrannous call everywhere torments me. If I am not quivering like a snake in the hands of a pythoness, I am cold." The middle-aged Oriental was Zhou. By using brushstrokes as bold as Delacroix, he conveyed his passion and desire towards free creation. In his opinion, instead of imitating others, artists should have their own characteristics and styles. Although Delacroix and Zhou used different methods of expression, their goal was the same: to break old rules and convey their real feelings.
就他两个人都是我们讲的中西不同形态的浪漫主义的破局之人，但是他们所破局的方式，他们采用的语言，他们破局之后所带出来的文化现象，绝了。
Delacroix's unconventional career started with a painting he saw at the age of 20. This is that painting that caused him to run through the streets of Paris. It changed his life forever. The raft of the Medusa was based on a real shipwreck. After the disaster happened, the captain and officers escaped in a lifeboat. Other refugees had drifted for 13 days on a raft before they were rescued. The painter Theodore Géricault conveyed his anger through the exaggerated figures. In the dim yellow painting is a group of scared and hopeless people. Drifting aimlessly on the dark and cold sea, they're on the edge of despair. Suddenly, a ship appears on the horizon. They shout and cry for help. They lift a person aloft. This person symbolizes their desire to survive. However, it is not a goddess or a white hero. Instead, it's a black figure. In this way, Géricault conveyed the idea that life was more important than all classes and races. This was no doubt a challenge, as it questioned the social rules of the time. French people called this spirit Romanticism. Having seen the painting, young Delacroix made up his mind to express people's deepest feelings in his own paintings. Ignoring rules seemed to be the lifelong path Xu Wei was to follow, from art to his ultimate fate. Having finished an imperial examination too early, Xu Wei began to draw a picture in the margin of his paper, showing himself coming in first place in the exam. This irritated the main examiner. It was said that Xu Wei took the imperial exam 8 times, but never made it beyond the county level. We can perhaps infer that since Xu Wei didn't realize his ambition of becoming an official through the imperial examinations, he turned to painting, calligraphy, literature, drama, and music for comfort. From these paintings of peonies, we can see that in Xu Wei's time, artists preferred imitating traditional realistic painting styles and the ink and wash painting style. They pursue pretty and delicate styles. But Xu Wei's painting was much more impressionistic. His brush strokes were very fast, with only 1 line and 1 drop of ink. This is not just a peony, but a display of blooming passion. Perhaps it symbolizes the painter's spiritual world. Xu Wei's large ink marks and wild scribble lines are not delicate at all. Yet the peony is still as beautiful and elegant as real flowers.
这些用物，它是在一个中国绘画的语境当中，它再怎么姿势汪洋，它再怎么淋漓酣畅，跟那个血淋淋的东西它不一回事。它表现的还是中国人对自然的那样一种淡淡的伤感。而在德拉克罗瓦这里呢，他是把那种拜伦他们的那种浪漫主义的诗意融在他的绘画语言当中，表现了一个个真实而沸腾的场面。
This is Delacroix's painting of Massacre at Chios, which was based on Byron's poems. The painting comes from a real incident. It depicts the Turks' massacre of the Greeks. In both Delacroix's time and Xu Wei's, the ideological trend called Romanticism was very popular. Their paintings were called Romantic paintings, after this trend. Xu Wei lived between 1521 and 1593. At that time, a drama called the Peony Pavilion was very popular. The drama opens with a girl in love. She goes on a date with someone she loves, but love is regarded as a social taboo at the time. People started to believe that the free expression of real feelings and desires in literature and poems was not immoral. Instead, it was beautiful. By contrast, the artistic style that blindly imitated ancient art was criticized. Xu Wei once said that although some birds can mimic human words, they are still birds in nature. It meant that if poets blindly imitated predecessors, they would be like birds, repeating human words. Their poems would not be of any value. Xu Wei embodied this conception in his calligraphy and paintings.
不论是徐渭也好，德拉克洛瓦也好，他们的绘画当中有诗，绘画当中把那种诗意包裹成一个整体，形成了一个我们叫做浪漫主义之浪漫的那个文化核心，这个他们又是相同的。
In the 19th century, when Delacroix drew this painting, there was another love story, like the Peony Pavilion, that moved thousands of people. It was Victor Hugo's romantic novel, The Hunchback of Notre Dame.
Ça vous fait plaisir?
Oui. Merci, Quasimodo.
Many Chinese people who have read the novel or watched the movie are moved by the love of Quasimodo for Esmeralda. In Hugo's preface to Cromwell, he wrote, "It will realize that everything in creation is not humanly beautiful, that the ugly exists beside the beautiful, the unshapely beside the graceful, the grotesque on the reverse of the sublime, evil with good, darkness with light."
Le romantisme est quand même un mouvement plus général, donc c'est un mouvement qui s'inspire beaucoup de la littérature et qui sert de porte-drapeau aussi à la musique.
Under the influence of Romanticism, Delacroix put aside the classical painting style of that time. He abandoned the stable and delicate composition mode. His paintings look very dynamic. The colours used are extremely vigorous and brilliant. There are many eye-catching scenes in his paintings, including fighting with fate and facing death.
这种红棕色，在红棕色的背后，为了突出红棕色，古绿色做它的对比色陪衬，这样一种表达激情的方式，我们看了以后，我们感觉血管在流，肌肉在颤动的这样一种色彩，它是饱含着热泪出来的，所以，应该来说，它是跨越千古的。
He knows he will die soon. However, his eyes are full of indifference. It seems that everything is only a dream. This is Delacroix's style of romance.
在德拉克洛瓦这里，他是画人、画历史、画死亡、画异族的奇观。他是用色彩来歌颂死亡。徐渭在画这些花鸟大雪衣，他在这里头是表现一种生机生趣，他是用一种墨来表现生命。主题的不同，这个主题决然拉开。
Xu Wei had painted flowers and fruit that didn't seem as realistic, and sometimes he would paint blurred figures. We can feel his depression and joy from the different application of his brushstrokes and inkworks. The meaning of the paintings lies in the use of various skills. Sometimes Xu Wei would mix alum solution with the ink to create various marvelous effects. The combination of ink and water was perhaps a remedy and comfort in Xu Wei's unhappy life. Delacroix's paintings were about people and animals. He was a frequent visitor to zoos, but often painted creatures not found in zoos. One of his friends said that he could paint a tiger using a cat as a model. This reminds us of the woman he created in his Liberty Leading the People. She stands among the crowd, pushing her way forward. It seems as if she may miss a step or jump right out of the picture.
Mais c'est un tableau qui a choqué en son temps parce qu'il montrait une allégorie, donc une femme, c'est-à-dire la représentation de la liberté, donc une femme avec la poitrine à l'air, au milieu de personnages de la vie réelle.
Delacroix put an ordinary-looking woman among revolutionaries, holding a weapon and wearing a Phrygian cap, which symbolized freedom. Her red cheeks, bronze-colored skin, and aggressive gestures imply that she is very excited.
坚挺的乳房，硕壮的体格，这样一个中年妇女，她是中年妇女，她其实又是类似于神一样，所以我觉得德拉克洛瓦在这里是满怀激情的刻画了这样一个半神半人的这样一个形象。
The painting is given a declarative name, Liberty Leading the People. And people no longer care which battle it describes. It becomes a source of inspiration for French people seeking freedom. And the goddess becomes a symbol of revolution, liberation, and history-making.
德拉克罗瓦一生上万件的作品留下来，这是很少有的。他终其一生没有结婚，也是坎坷，但是呢，不像徐渭这样，江南这个地方人杰地灵，他养育了一批天才型的人物，但是命运不给这些天才型的人物以一个顺利的人生。徐渭刚刚出生没有大概100多天，父亲就去世了。 这之后，坎坷的命运一直跟着他，他从来没有顺利过。
Having lost his father when he was a baby, Xu Wei had to depend on others for a living. He failed the imperial examinations many times. With the dream of an official career crushed, he suffered from a split personality and spent 6 years in prison for accidentally killing his wife. A series of frustrations shocked this talented and arrogant genius. He tried to take his own life 9 times, cutting himself with an axe, putting a long nail in his ears, but miraculously, he survived all of these suicide attempts. Xu Wei's former home lies in a lane in Shaoxing. This white wall is like a piece of white paper. There is also a cluster of trees and a small pool. The couplet describes the place as having several unsteady rooms with one complicated person. We can imagine that a crazy artist turned his complicated feelings into self-mockery through his ramblings.
"浓的、淡的、块面的、线条的、点状的，都在恰到好处，感觉到中国人的那种细腻的内心和对万事万物的体察。这是中国人的诗意。"
Delacroix spent his twilight years in a house near the centre of Paris. He remained single for his entire life and described his love like this: "When people were meeting with their lovers, I was walking around my paintings." He gradually grew old and ill. Speaking and moving became more and more difficult for him.
Delacroix est célibataire, il a une gouvernante, une bonne, qui est là pour empêcher les admirateurs de venir le déranger. Il veut vraiment se concentrer sur son œuvre ultime, sur ses derniers...
A painter's life of art can transcend the time he or she lives in. Although from two different times and countries, both Zhou and Delacroix created new artistic features that had a great impact on later generations in different ways. In France, Delacroix is regarded as a master who opened the door to modern painting styles. Many painting geniuses were inspired by him, including Renoir, Cézanne and Van Gogh. Unconsciously, he helped cultivate Impressionist and Expressionist paintings. Xu Wei's seemingly simple and carefree paintings have also been adored by later generations. "60 years after Xu Wei's death, the great painter Ada Shanren saw his paintings and decided to follow his style. 120 years later, another famous painter, Jiang Banqiao, saw Xu's paintings and carved a seal, calling himself a running dog, following on the heels of Xu Wei. 300 years later, famous Chinese painter Qi Baishi also adored Zhou, Shi Tao, and Wu Changshou. He said he wanted to be a dog, running in the shadow of these three famous painters. That is the power of Romanticism.
中西不同的地方，我们如何在这个不同当中找到他们人性的光辉，让它存活在今天，让它和我们今天和我们的内心连续在一起，把它发展起来。
This painting, artist Jean-Baptiste Camille Corot, has the flavour of the Barbizon school. The Barbizon school paintings represent the final part of the Louvre's collection. However, this new genre changed Xu Beihong and the Chinese artistic concept during that period.
情，便飘向月之情。